Kansas Territory, October 1874. The wind blew dry and bitter across the tall grass, and the sun was already sinking behind the cottonwoods when Zinnia Zeller realized the padlock on the grain shed door had snapped shut. She dropped the rusted handle she had been gripping and lunged at the door. "No, no, no, please," she breathed, rattling it hard. "You locked us in." Footsteps crunched on gravel outside, then faded inside the dark shed. The air was thick with dust and the sharp scent of corn husks. Zinnia turned, eyes adjusting, and knelt beside the little girl huddled in a nest of burlap sacks. "Anabeth," she whispered, brushing sweat-soaked curls from her forehead. "I am here, baby, I am right here." The child's skin was hot to the touch. Her breathing came shallow and fast. Zinnia pulled off her shawl, tucking it around the girl's thin shoulders. "You rest, sweet pea, I will find a way out." But even as she said it, her heart sank. The shed was solid wood, the only window nailed shut. The lock outside was iron, and the man who'd snapped it closed Samuel Hart, the landowner she had worked for since spring, knew exactly what he had done. He'd seen her packing her things that morning. He'd seen her refuse his offer again and again. She and Anabeth were leaving. They were not his problem anymore. Except Samuel Hart never liked letting go of things he thought he owned. Zinnia's hands trembled as she pressed them to her face. She had no water, no food. She had wrapped up every last coin in a cloth bundle and buried it under the wagon axle outside. They were supposed to leave at first light. Now it was dusk, and she was locked in a grain shed with a feverish child, and no one knew where she was. Except maybe, just maybe, one man, Cullen Remy. She had not seen him in over a year. Not since he rode west into Cheyenne Territory with a wagon team and a promise to write. He never had. She understood. Men like Cullen did not write letters to women who stitched clothes and slept in haylofts, but Cullen had known Anabeth's mother, her sister, Aisline. He'd held the baby soft as a feather when she was born, right after the war ended. And he had looked Zinnia in the eye the day he left and said, "If there's ever trouble, you ride for me." She had not ridden, but maybe he had not ridden so far. Zinnia sat back on her heels, heart pounding. She had not cried in months, not when Aisline died after childbirth, not when she'd taken Anabeth in, not when Samuel Hart slammed the door on her second request for wages owed. But now, in the dark, she let one tear fall, then another. Anabeth whimpered. Zinnia crawled back to her side. "You hold on, sweetheart. You hold on, and I promise you I will get us out of here." Cullen Remy had not planned to ride back east, but something had gnawed at him all week. He had driven cattle from Dodge to Ellsworth, traded his last 3 pelts, and still he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had not seen Zinnia Zeller in 13 months, but he remembered her laugh and her wild hair. And the way she never asked for help, not once, but gave it freely. She had taken in her sister's baby without a blink. She had worked 3 jobs and never complained. So that morning, without telling anyone, he saddled his gelding and rode east with the wind at his back and a knot in his gut. By dusk, he reached Hart's property. It was quiet. Too quiet. The barn was empty. The house had lights flickering in the window, but no sign of Zinnia. He dismounted and scanned the yard. Then his eyes landed on the grain shed. The lock caught the light. He walked toward it. "Zinnia," he called softly. Inside, Zinnia froze. She crawled to the door and pressed her ear to it. That voice. Her heart slammed so hard against her ribs she thought she might faint. "Cullen," she whispered. He was already at the lock. "You are safe," he said, voice rough and sure. "I have you." The lock snapped open. Cullen swung the door wide, and she stumbled into the open air, Anabeth in her arms. The child moaned in her sleep, face slick with sweat. Cullen caught Zinnia by the elbow. "What happened?" "Locked us in," she gasped. "She has a fever." "I think it is bad." He did not ask more. He took off his coat and wrapped it around both of them. "Come on," he said. "My horse is saddled. I will get you to Doc Laren in town." Zinnia clutched the child tighter. "She is all I have." Cullen met her eyes. "Then she is all I have, too." The ride to town was a blur of wind and hooves and Zinnia's arms around Anabeth's tiny body. Cullen rode hard, his jaw set, one hand steady on the reins, the other gripping Zinnia's thigh to keep her anchored behind him. They made it to town by midnight. Doc Laren took Anabeth without question. Zinnia stood by the door, trembling as the doctor laid the girl on the table and began to work. Cullen stayed beside her, his hand never leaving hers. "She will be all right," he said. Zinnia looked up, and this time her tears were not from fear. He was here, he had come. After a year, after everything he had come, and he had not changed, still tall and calm and steady as the earth beneath her feet. "I did not think you would remember me," she whispered. Cullen cupped her face. "I never forgot." By morning, Anabeth's fever broke. She slept under clean sheets in the doctor's guest room, her breathing soft and even. Zinnia sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching the sun rise. Cullen stepped out beside her, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. "You always did wake early," he said. She took the mug, fingers brushing his. "You came for me." "I always would," he said. She looked at him, long and quiet. "I thought you forgot us." "I tried to forget," he said honestly, "but I could not. I left because I thought you deserved better." "I never asked for better," she said, voice low. "I just wanted you." A long silence stretched between them. Cullen sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I do not want to ride away again," he said. "Not without you." "Not without her." Zinnia blinked, her whole body still. "She is not mine," he said, "but she is yours, and that is enough for me." She turned to him, and this time there was no hesitation in her eyes. "I want to go where you go," she said. "I want a life with you." Cullen reached for her hand. "Then we start today." And just like that, after all the dust and hurt and silence, something new began, soft, steady, and real. The following days brought the kind of quiet Zinnia hadn't known since she was a girl helping her mother string tobacco leaves in the low country of Georgia. The town doctor allowed them to stay in the back room of his small house for 3 nights, long enough for Anabeth's fever to ease into sleep, and for Zinnia to begin breathing without tightness in her chest. Cullen didn't press. He spent daylight hours mending a wagon tongue in the livery yard or helping the blacksmith rehang his forge door, never lingering too close but never far either. Each dusk, he returned with something small, once a folded scrap of linen, another time a tin of dried apples. Never asked how she was. Just handed her what he'd brought and waited beside her while the sun finished its work on the rooftops. She watched him from the window sometimes. The way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he carried weight that didn't show in his shoulders. He never asked what happened that night in the shed. And she hadn't told him. Not yet. On the 4th morning, with Anabeth curled safely in the quilted cot the doctor's wife had laid out, Zinnia stepped out into the crisp air and found Cullen saddling his horse. His coat was slung over the horn and his hat was low, casting his face in shadow. "You leaving?" she asked, voice even. He tightened the girth strap without looking up. "Just to the edge of town. There's a man there hires hands to drive winter freight. I want to see if he'll take me on." She crossed her arms, fingers working at the seam of her sleeve. "You don't need to do that." "I do," he said. "If we're going anywhere, we'll need coin. I can't offer you a place to rest your head on promises alone." Zinnia stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. "Where is it you think we're going?" He lifted his gaze then, slow and steady. "Wherever you choose. But I've been thinking about a parcel near the Solomon River. Land's good. There's a spring-fed creek. I can get seed by March if I work steady through winter." She hadn't expected that, not the place, not the plan, not the quiet certainty in his voice. "You've already decided all this?" "No," he said. "I dreamed it. There's a difference." He swung into the saddle, then paused. "You'd be safe there, and she'd have a yard to run in come spring." Zinnia looked down toward the doctor's house. A curl of smoke drifted from the chimney. She imagined Anabeth with her arms full of wildflowers, her cheeks full of sun. "I don't want to be beholden," she said. Cullen's brow creased. "You think this is charity?" "I think it's more than you owe," she answered. He leaned forward, one hand resting on the horn, the other hanging loose at his side. "Zinnia, I never owed you. I wanted you. I still do." She stared at him, her throat dry. "I'll be back before supper," he said. "If the man's got no work, I'll find another way." She shaded her eyes with her hand. "What if I say yes to that land?" He didn't smile, but something in his face changed, softened. "Then I'll build you a home on it," he said, "and I'll never leave again." She didn't answer, not with words. She just stepped back, letting him ride out with the morning light, and turned toward the house, her chest fuller than it had been in months. Inside, Anabeth stirred, her cheeks pink, her eyes clearer. She reached for Zinnia's hand without speaking, then laid her head back down. Zinnia sat beside her and watched the window. The wind had changed. It carried something warmer now. Something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like a beginning. By the time the first frost settled along the town's boardwalk, Zinnia had hemmed a wool dress from scrap cloth and traded a pair of her late sister's shoes for a hand-stitched bonnet that fit Anabeth's head snug. She hadn't asked Cullen where he'd slept since riding to the freight yard, but each morning when she stepped out to the pump, he was already nearby, hat in hand, waiting. That morning, he held a folded paper with an unfamiliar stamp on the corner. "I signed on," he said, offering it to her. 3 weeks' work driving freight to the river settlements. Pay's honest, and the foreman promised a bonus if I make good time. Zinnia studied the paper as if it might change under her gaze. 3 weeks leaves me clear by mid-November. That's enough time to build walls before snow, she nodded once slowly. And if something happens along the road, I'll keep a page in my coat pocket, he said. "One for you, I'll write if I can." Zinnia touched the edge of the paper but didn't take it. "I don't need letters. I need you to come back with both hands and a sound mind." "I've ridden harder trails," he said, "but I've never had someone waiting before." She didn't answer, just reached for the satchel he'd stowed behind the post and handed it to him without a word. It was patched at the strap, the only repair she'd made that week without charging extra. He looked down at it, then back at her. "You sewed this. You'll need it," she said. He took the bag and stepped back, but didn't mount right away. "I left something with the doctor's wife, a parcel. If I don't come back, she's to give it to you." Her jaw tightened. "Don't say that. I only mean to be sure you're looked after." "I don't want what's left behind," she said. "I want you." They stood there a moment longer, the air between them too still for the wind to stir. Then he reached out, slow and sure, brushing the back of his fingers against her wrist. "I'll be back before the river freezes." She didn't cry. She didn't ask him to stay. She simply watched as he swung into the saddle and rode toward the east road, his coat flaring once at the hem before settling flat. That night, Anabeth curled into her side without protest, the fever long since faded, her cheeks full again. The doctor's wife had offered Zinnia a cot in the pantry, but she'd refused. She'd rather keep the girl close, where she could hear her breathing and know the world hadn't shifted again. Days passed. Zinnia took in mending at the mercantile, stitching buttons and letting out seams with fingers that ached by dusk. She kept Anabeth with her always, perched on a stool with a slate and chalk. The girl didn't speak much, but she hummed sometimes, and every time she did, Zinnia felt something in her rib cage loosen. The parcel Cullen had left stayed wrapped in oilcloth under the doctor's cupboard. Zinnia hadn't touched it. She wouldn't not unless she had to. On the 15th day, the freight clerk came through town, driving a mule cart of supplies for winter. Zinnia caught him outside the feed store. "You see Cullen Remy?" she asked, brushing flour dust from her apron. The clerk nodded. "He passed through the flats 4 days ago, headed west. Wagon in good shape, riding strong." She nodded, not letting the relief show. That night, she sat beside the doctor's hearth and stitched a square of muslin into a kerchief with a row of tiny green leaves along the hem. She didn't know if it would suit him, but her hands needed something to finish. It was on the 21st morning that she heard the hooves, not rushed, not urgent, just steady. She stepped out to see him there, dust on his coat, eyes tired but bright. He dismounted without a word and held out the parcel she hadn't touched. "You didn't open it," he said. "I said I wouldn't unless I had to." He set it on the stoop. "Then it's yours anyway." "What is it?" He rested his hand on the porch rail. "A deed, 30 acres near the creek bend, cabin will need building but the land's ours." Zinnia looked at him, her breath catching. "Ours, if you want it to be." She stepped down the stoop until they were eye to eye. "You sure you want to tie yourself to a woman who carries another's child?" "I'm not tying myself to a burden," he said. "I'm choosing both of you." She didn't speak. Just reached into her apron and pulled out the kerchief. He took it, unfolded it. "You sewed this." She nodded. He traced the stitched leaves with his thumb. "I don't deserve you." "No," she said, taking his hand, "but you came back, and that's what matters." Behind them, the door creaked. Anabeth stood in the frame, wrapped in a quilt, one hand rubbing her eye. Cullen bent down slowly and opened his arms. The girl hesitated, then stepped into them. Zinnia watched the way he held her carefully, like she was something he'd been trusted with. Not owned, not owed, just given. And for the first time in too long, she let herself believe in something lasting. In the morning, they would ride out to the land, the three of them, and build something that would hold. The land stretched quiet and golden beneath the low November sun. Dry bluestem grass rippled in slow waves, and the creek curved like a silver thread beyond the cottonwoods. Cullen dismounted first, leading his mare by the reins as Zinnia stepped down from the wagon. Anabeth sat bundled beside the sack of winter flour, her eyes wide, still waking from the last mile's rattle. Zinnia's boots sank into soft earth as she walked the rise. The wind carried the scent of cedar and far-off firewood, and the only sound was the hush of the creek against frozen stones. Cullen stopped beside her. "There's a clearing past that stand of ash, best spot for the cabin, near enough to water, high enough to stay dry." She glanced at the ridge, then back toward the wagon. "And the girl, I'll carry her," he said. She turned toward him. "You sure? I've carried heavier things." She didn't answer, just walked back and reached for the blanket-wrapped child. Anabeth stirred but didn't cry. Zinnia passed her into Cullen's arms, watching how he shifted her weight with quiet care, settling her against his chest as if he'd done it 100 times. They moved together across the field, past the tree line, until the ground leveled onto a patch of frost-hardened soil. There were no fences, no markers but the ones he'd set in place himself, stones laid smooth in a rectangle, a split log sawhorse. A coil of rope hung from a branch, waiting. Cullen lowered Anabeth onto the folded canvas he'd brought to sit her on, then turned to Zinnia. "I started cutting beams last week, hauled them from the mill myself." "You didn't say. You didn't ask." She stepped closer to the squared timbers stacked beneath a rough lean-to. They were straight-cut, bark stripped, ends notched proper. "You know what you're doing." "I built a smokehouse back in Arkansas," he said. "This is just more of it." She reached down, ran her hand along the smooth grain. "What made you come all the way back for us?" He didn't answer right away. He looked toward the creek, jaw tightening. "I saw too many good things pass me by. I wasn't about to let this be one of them." Zinnia rose. "You could have just taken the land, started clean." "I never wanted it clean," he said. "I wanted it honest." She nodded once, then glanced toward the trees. "When do we start?" "I was waiting on you." The first post hole took most of the morning. Cullen dug while Zinnia measured the spacing, marking each spot with a twist of willow branch. Anabeth dozed in the wagon's shadow, wrapped in pelts Cullen had traded a saddle for. By midday, Zinnia had dirt under her nails and a blister opening beneath her ring finger. She didn't complain. Cullen watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the way she leaned into the shovel like it owed her something. "You ever built a house before?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I've torn one down." He paused, leaning on the spade. "That's so. My daddy's smokehouse caught fire when I was 19. We spent 2 days tearing the frame apart to keep it from spreading. I remember the way the boards hissed when they hit the wet ground." He nodded slowly. "Then you already know how a place holds heat." She met his gaze. "I know how fast it can be lost." They worked until the sun dropped low and the wind cut sharper. Cullen laid a tarp over the stacked beams and checked the rope lines twice before leading the mare to the creek. When he returned, Zinnia was sitting beside Anabeth, humming something low, almost without tune. He crouched beside her, brushing wood dust from his palms. "We can sleep in the wagon tonight. Tomorrow I'll get the ridgepole up." She didn't look at him. "You planning to marry me?" He didn't blink. "Yes," she turned her face toward his. "Not because of the child. No, not because you feel sorry. No," she studied him, wind tugging at the loose strands of her hair. "You don't think I'm too stubborn?" "I think you're exactly as you should be," she exhaled, slow. "Then ask me." He shifted, setting both hands on his knees. "Zinnia Zeller, will you be my wife and let me build this place with you, board by board?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." The wind moved through the tall grass, and somewhere far off a bird called once, sharp against the silence. Anabeth stirred, eyes blinking open, and reached for Zinnia's hand. Cullen stood and offered his palm. Zinnia took it, rising with him. They walked back to the wagon together, the three of them, leaving a trail of prints in the frost-hardened ground, leading toward something that belonged to them alone. By mid-December, the cabin walls stood waist-high, every beam notched and fitted with care. The roof joists were stacked under canvas, waiting for weather to hold. Until then, Cullen and Zinnia slept in the wagon, while Anabeth nestled each night in a straw-lined crate they'd lined with wool and tucked between them. The cold came steady now, thickening the ground and stiffening their hands before the sun had time to soften it. They rose early, before the frost lifted from the grass, and worked until their breath fogged in the air. Zinnia carried stones to line the hearth while Cullen shaped the ridge beam. Every task was shared, not spoken of, just done like breath, like heartbeat. One morning, as Zinnia stood sorting the last of the dry goods they'd hauled from town, she pulled out a folded cloth she hadn't noticed before. It was linen, finely stitched and wrapped around a small iron skillet. Inside it was a note, written not in words but in the pressed pattern of dried cedar leaves. She turned to Cullen, who was hauling split logs to the lean-to. "This yours?" she asked, holding up the bundle. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked over. "I traded for it." Woman at the Osage crossroads said it'd hold heat better than tin. Zinnia ran her fingers over the iron handle. "You think I'm going to cook for you every day once this place is finished?" He leaned against the wagon wheel, the corners of his eyes creasing. "No, I figure we'll take turns." "But I'd rather eat what you burn than what I ruin." She didn't laugh. Instead, she folded the cloth again and tucked it into her apron. "I can't promise much, Cullen." "I didn't ask for promises," he said. She looked up at him, the wind catching strands of her hair. "You ever think about what it means raising a child that isn't blood?" "I think about who she looks at when she wakes," he said. "And who she reaches for when she's scared. That's what counts." Zinnia's throat tightened. "She's not asked for anything, not once." "She doesn't have to," he said. "She knows she's safe." They stood there a long moment, the wind moving through the trees behind them. Later that day, they cleared space for the hearth. Cullen showed her how to set the stones so they stayed upright through freeze and thaw. He told her about a childhood spent near the White River, where winters cracked porch boards and took the week before spring. She listened, her fingers red from the cold, pressing down each stone with quiet strength. That night, after Anabeth had fallen asleep with her thumb tucked under her chin, Zinnia sat beside Cullen under the wagon's canvas. They shared a biscuit gone dry, biting from opposite sides. He watched her chew, eyes steady. "You ever think about giving her your sister's name?" Zinnia looked down at the child. "Aisline belonged to a different time. I want her to have something new." Cullen nodded. "Then we'll give her something that's hers alone." They didn't speak again until the lantern burned low. Then Zinnia turned, her voice barely above the wind. "You ever been someone's husband before?" "No, you," she smiled, dry and soft, "not even close." "Well," he murmured, "we'll learn it together." The next week they rode into town, Anabeth bundled on Zinnia's lap beneath two shawls. The preacher stood behind his stove, coat unbuttoned, glasses slipping down his nose. "You sure about this?" he asked, looking between them. Cullen nodded once. Zinnia said, "We are." The ceremony was plain: a single prayer, a circle of hands, and the words spoken clear. Anabeth fidgeted in Zinnia's arms, and Cullen reached over to hold her hand through the final blessing. Afterward, they signed the ledger and left with a paper folded twice and tied with twine. Zinnia tucked it into her sewing basket without a word. When they returned to the homestead, the wind had shifted east. Zinnia stepped down from the wagon and looked across the field, her hand resting on the small of her back. "You think we'll get the roof on before the snow?" Cullen stepped beside her. "We will. Then comes spring," she said, "we plant." He looked out toward the tree line and build her a swing. Zinnia turned toward him, her hands still. "You want more of what? Children, land, all of it." He studied her face. "I want the days to be filled. I want the nights quiet. I want you beside me when I wake." She nodded once. "Then we'll make room." He took her hand, rough from hammer and rope, and she let her fingers close around his. The seasons shifted slow. The roof rose, stones held, the stove lit warm. Snow came and passed, and the land turned green again. Anabeth learned to walk between the furrows. Zinnia stitched dresses in the evenings and read aloud by lamplight, her voice soft in the hush of dusk. Cullen planted rows of corn and beans, his hands steady, his eyes always returning to the door where she stood. They never spoke of what might have come if he hadn't ridden back. Life didn't ask for what-ifs. It asked only that you show up, that you hold fast, that you carry what's given and treat it with care, and so they did together. Always.